and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Coatlicue Girl by Gris Muñoz. Last episode, we began our discussion of Coatlicue Girl, focusing on the major themes, ideas, and connections we've made. This episode, we will discuss some of our favorite pieces from the first half of the collection.
What's up? Welcome back.
Good to have everyone back. Buenas tardes to other listeners. We introduced this book, in our last episode, and so as Vanessa mentioned, we'll be talking about half of the book, and we're gonna have to be a little selective because there's quite a few works, and we want to keep it to about an hour or so. But I think you, Richie, we're going to talk about the lead off or discussion here. And we had also, though, put out a call for questions. So if anyone of you have any questions about it, we still have half the book left to talk about. And as Richie mentioned, we're hoping to, actually host Gris and be able to talk to her virtually. So if you all have any questions, you can direct them to her or you can direct them to us, and we'd be happy to have your listener questions about the book. But you, Richie, wanted to talk about the foreword to begin. Not the foreword, but the epigraph, right?
Right. Yeah, the epigraph. Plenty, as you mentioned, there's plenty to talk about and lots to unpack. I think it's there's a certain kind of density in this book, which I as a reader I love. And the first episode, we talked about her dedication, her acknowledgments being in the front of the book, which I thought was really great. And her, just kind of showing love to her community, those who supported and that I think has maybe inspired and influenced her over the years. And it's no different, of course, in the epigraph. She quotes from Irene Lara Silva, who, as I had mentioned in the previous episode, participated in Gris's online book release with Mujeres de Maíz. So once again, if you guys want to, you can go on YouTube and actually watch that. Kind of one of the bonuses, I guess, of this pandemic, right? Is now it's documented. You can watch it on YouTube. You didn't necessarily have to be there at the live event. And so Irene Lara Silva she read a little bit of her work. And of course, I'm always a big fan of the epigraph, as it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book, and it captures the spirit. And so it's, so I'll read it out loud and kind of speak a little bit to why I think this kind of creates an echo that lasts throughout the rest of Gris's book. It asks, have you never heard the fire singing as if every sound hurt, as if every note was pulled from deep within, and the leap from emotion to sound left a wound, ragged and bleeding? But give me that song. It is the song I need to stay true. The fire has come. The fire has sung. I think it's a really powerful invocation, right? That's exactly what it is an epigraph as invocation, which references this concept of being able to sing away the blues, so to speak, through your pain, or as it's mentioned here, a wound. Last episode we had mentioned kind of the invocation as well to Anzaldúa, where she talks about the border, and it's definitely a showcase of how you can write about your wounds, your pain, your emotions, and use it to heal as if a song, right? As if a fire, right? A singing fire. So I think it speaks to the power in which the words Gris is invoking for this book. And, of course, like I mentioned, once again, just the fact that it's a friend of hers, a fellow author, fellow writer, speaks multitudes.
Yeah, it's well put. I think what you said about it being an invocation, brings back the idea of the written word originating, from the oral tradition. And I know later on, we're going to talk about a poem that speaks to that. But I think, you also mentioned the connection to Anzaldúa, right? And, it does call to mind the herida abierta that she talks about, given that this work, much of it is set in the frontera, and but it does say a lot, that it is something that needs to be processed. You open that Pandora's box, but ultimately, it needs to be heard. And I think this is what makes this work unique, is it's not just something that is on the page, but it really does come alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course, I don't know if you guys had anything else to say about the epigraph, Vanessa.
Well, you guys hit all of the points. I think it definitely speaks to the collection as a whole. I like the use of fire and song, like, being put together, just because it feels like, even with all of the pain and everything that's going on, there's growth that comes from that, and there's like strength that comes from that also.
Cool.
and does take us then to with that epigraph, we talked about last time about Los Dos, and they're Cristian and Ramon Cárdenas, and in the following work on page 10, which is the first art piece that we see inside the text, is from Los Dos, and it's paired with a poem called Sometimes. I think this is we talked about this collection, right? It's hybrid, and so there's poems and there's going to be short stories. So as the first poem, what did you guys make of it?
Well, for me, I think you guys were talking about it earlier, and I got something completely different from it.
What did you get from it?
To me, it seemed like someone that's been abused, or I guess raped, is what I got from it.
Okay.
That I see that, there is kind of that emphasis of I do not want to remember. Is that what you were thinking of? And the snake? Yeah. That's
what I got from it.
Yeah.
And just like the idea of feeling alone.
Yeah.
And I felt like the folded fangs represented not being able to fight back, I guess.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's pretty astute, I would say. And I think even with the artwork that's paired with, it could actually kind of work, because you have the imagery of the jaguar, the mask, which kind of, again, setting up things you'll see throughout the book, in both the poems and in the short stories. This call to your indigenous ancestors, and so you have a person here drawn that I think shares, you would associate with someone in that background. And but you also have the reference to what they're wearing. So you have the jaguar mask, which I think is a very common symbol, a very popular symbol in Mesoamerican cultures, because I think the jaguar kind of represents the warrior. I think it's been represented to talk about the ability to cross between worlds, Earth and then even the spirit world. And I think that's something that she calls to her spiritual side. And I think that's important here, because I think in the terms of the way you read this first poem, I think she's referring to this pain, and how we're still warriors. She's still a warrior. And so she's kind of referring to, and you'll see that referenced later on in other pieces. Of course, you also have the snakes represented in the photos as well on top of the head. And I think in the jewelry and the necklace you have here, you have the kind of like the open heart, bleeding heart kind of concept, the open hands, and then just even in the middle of the skull, probably representing death or even the spirit world, because she talks a lot about being able to communicate with ancestors, or seeing them. So it's a pretty short piece, but it does pack that punch, and I think kind of just sets up that yes, there's pain, and throughout the book she references animals, right, and being able to maybe identify
Mm.
with them. So I do really like, I think I can see your interpretation in this light as well, right? That this in not despite, but in addition with the pain, kind of having that woman warrior attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's amazing how much you can examine from the artwork. I think it can stand alone on its own merits, but it can also really enhance the appreciation of the poem or the story that it's coupled with. And I think this is one of the many reasons why I feel this book is so special. um, and the allusion at the end of the poem takes us back, like you were saying, Richie, to the title, Coatlicue, and who is translated as like the
Serpents.
serpent's girl. And it also takes me back to Ansel Dua, in Borderlands La Frontera, the new Mestiza, where she talks a lot about what that means, the symbolism and its origins in Azteca culture, and also how it kind of was appropriated by colonizers into Virgen de Guadalupe, along with Tonantzin, another earth goddess.
Right.
So I think I it's I really like how Gris is able to kind of blend these mythologies together, modernize them, put them in a context where you can kind of see them, and different ways, and just like you were saying, Vanessa, that like you interpret it a certain way. um because traditionally, the snake is kind of meant to represent the stomping down evil, or the negative forces or whatever, you know and so yeah, I think it's one of the things about this work. It's just so many ways to interpret it.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the El Maíz on the next one?
Yeah, well, the next couple of poems, El Maíz and Fronteriza, kind of, I've heard Gris in the past mention how this collection is almost like a coming of age work. And so I know oftentimes we want to not necessarily conflate the author with the speaker of whatever we're reading. So in some instances, I understand that I think it's biographical in the sense that it comes from experiences growing up. But also at the same time, it could also be shared experiences, because I think I've made a point to mention so far, like her sense of the communal. And I think these stories are not just her stories, but other people's stories, her friends and who she's encountered over the years, and the people. And so with Al Mais, I think is a very interesting kind of placement of what it means to be born here in the border, right? She talks about being born and right here in the USA, and in terms of the language, I think you have the interesting use of not cornflakes, right? But as we kind of understand in that Spanglish sense of cornflakes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And talking about, 'cause she references the land a lot as well. There's a lot of references to nature, not just in the animals she invokes, but also just like the land, right? The sacred land, and who she is, what she is. But there's also just kind of this reference to el maíz se hecho cornflakes, that very kind of U.S. North American like consumerism kind of reference. So it's a little bit of that push and pull of identity.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's a very fascinating look at assimilation, and like you said, with consumerism, like how a product that was goes back centuries, right? Maíz, and critical to um, um, indigenous agriculture, has now become this processed product that doesn't really provide any nutritional benefits. And and that you see, you know, like you said, as part of this mass consumerism, right? That is very corporatized. And so I kind of see it, you know, what you mentioned about mi tierra sagrada, y conoce mi cara, y el maíz se ha hecho con phrase, like you said, in terms of identity, there's been an erasure there. And I think it's been violent too, you know, because the land itself is sacred, you know, but of course there's nothing sacred about cornflakes, you know. And so I think there's a lot there about colonization, and it just makes it another very powerful poem, you know. And she repeats that, but then in the second stanza it kind of becomes like a downward spiral kind of thing, is the way I see it.
Yeah, it's the first stanza, right, is kind of put together, and the other one just kind of starts to unwind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of continues with the next poem, Fronteriza, you know, talking about just what that means to her, and then also just kind of being inundated with, uh, you know, northern, right, culture, even to the point of wanting to change her nose with Mayan features, right, and getting it fixed, quote unquote fixed, and what that means. And I think that kind of just talks about a lot of the maybe the psychological placement of kind of feeling these two cultures within you,
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes at odds with each other.
yeah, I mean, kind of, you know, the price of selling out, right? You know, as she says, "Your promesas de plata." Um, what did you think, Vanessa, of this one?
Yeah, I kind of related to it, especially like, so my first language was also Spanish, but then
Hmm.
once I started speaking English, that kind of took over, and I was still really young, like probably like 3 or 4 already.
Mm.
So like the second stanza, I mean not the second, the third, where she talks about learning English really easily.
Hmm.
I related to that one.
Hmm.
Mm. Cuando era chiquilla aprendí inglés fácil y yo me reía de las muchachitas que no podían. And to the listeners in who don't speak Spanish, she's saying, you know, that when she was little, as you said, she would pick up the English tongue easily, but she would laugh at the kids who didn't, you know. And I think that is true, right? That, like you're saying, Vanessa, that, you know, it happens. It's very common here in the border, but I
Yeah.
think the whole kind of mocking, right, of like someone who doesn't know English, and you
Hmm.
know, because they don't know better.
Yeah, I mean yeah, my experience is in that way where I grew up speaking Spanish, you know, being taken care of by my grandparents. But as soon as I entered school, like English was like, you know, what I felt like
Mhm.
I had to learn, and it took over to the degree in which my Spanish is so weak. You know, I'm not comfortable or you know confident in it at
Yeah.
much at all. Which you know it has been a point of conflict for me, you know, personally all this time.
Yeah, and we've talked about it in different ways before also. And you know, I think notably in Everything Begins in It's at the Kentucky Club. Um, but I think I also like how this poem is a confession, you know, and so it kind of brings this religious element to it. Well, maybe pseudo-religious, you know. I don't want to ascribe necessarily like a certain religion to it, but you know, she says, "Y te quiero confesar que he despreciado y he maltratado a mi masculinidad." And I think it really is important to note that, you know, this is in Spanish, you know, and so it does the language justice. And you were saying, Vanessa, that this is the first work we're looking at where we see entire poems in Spanish. And I think you know, it's another kind of invocation. You know, she calls it "Oye mi canto de peregrina," like listen to my song, my pilgrim song. You know, and so it really is kind of alluding and paying homage to the oral tradition, and the need to be heard. You know, that
Mm.
you have to listen, and this is important. And the love that she speaks to of here in the confession is something we have seen before with it was reminded me of We Cast a Shadow, because just like he wants his son, to remove that birthmark from him, um, so too does she want to remove the features of that indigenous nose, the Maya, um, simply so that she can fit in, right? So she can look more American. And I think we also talked about that with Maurice himself, right, where he was talking about how people change their names to appear more American or what have you, more palatable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, then we move on to Beer Run, the first of her short stories in this collection, and I think she has a real strength in her short stories. I really liked Beer Run, and from what I remember, this is kind of one of the first stories she was able to get published. And I was able to identify in certain aspects with it. I really enjoyed this narrator, and just I think it took me to this place where she's hanging outside her yard and relaxing, and this mention of McGruff the crime dog. But now she's thinking about it in light of she's outside rolling a joint. And I know in this show we always talk about food and recipes whenever that's mentioned, and I think
Mhm.
she has a paragraph or like a couple paragraphs, a little section there where she talks about rolling a joint, which I think there's such a tenderness to it that it's almost like writing a recipe, right? She says I found it's a good skill to have even if you don't smoke. But she goes into detail of that, and really just kind of the story of the beer run, the corner store. I think I mentioned this offhand in discussion between the three of us, but I feel like I could see this scene myself, just looking outside my window at the corner store across the street, a beer run, some kids going. And again, it also kind of just talks about community, the stoners, the kids, and it's funny, they waited for her to get her drink, and then they went and did the beer run.
Yeah, I like that there's a certain lightheartedness to it, and that interaction, and like you said, it's very relatable. I think all of us growing up here in the border, at least I can't speak to other communities, but this kind of thing is common. And like you said, I think that description though of the lighting up, is you called it like a recipe, right? And I kind of also see it almost like a ritual, and not in any kind of meaningful, like not in an indigenous sense, but just as in a general sense, in the sense that like this is just something that the epigraph opens with talking about fire, right? And in page 17 she says, um, I like to roll them long and thin, tight, with the joint hanging out of my mouth. I'll light the fire, whatever fire. Um, and so it kind of harkens back to that opening. This is one of the fires that is lit in this collection. Um, and that, here in the border and many places across the country, the majority of places, it's something that it's criminalized behavior, and um, she also talks about how on page 18 the what she calls the chapetillos, or the guy calls Redbeard calls chapetillos, they're framed as like criminals, criminales bestias, beast, and because of they got bandanas and all that, and I think that also speaks to the way that we just marginalize people who might steal something, might loot something, might get something that they want, or more importantly need, and of course that they don't actually need like have a real need for the beer, but it does kind of speak to that kind of marginalization of people who are destitute, people who are committing these kinds of things that we see as criminal. But it's kind of funny, right, that like to her it's kind of just like almost like a gag, right, or a rite of passage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Good points. I think there's the little bit of that kind of biting humor in there, right? The real criminals buy their beer before midnight,
Yeah.
right? And also how it affects the community, because then it goes on to say post beer run is another story where the cops shut down the store, and maybe sometimes that's people need access to it for maybe something as simple as getting milk for your kid, which I'm referencing a story later on, but
Yeah. Yeah, that is kind of interesting, kind of seeing how the stories are within the same universe as well. So yeah, that was the first short story. And unless anyone had any more thoughts on it, the next one was Costco right after.
yeah.
I really like this one. I think it's a lot shorter, but it's just very like I didn't see it coming. I didn't see that ending coming.
Oh, me
It's
neither.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, what did you make of that ending? So, just to kind of give listeners a brief overview, like they're basically just this Costco, Griselda is the narrator, and they're just shopping, right? And then there's this we see them, all the time, the knife salesman, right? Um, and she talks about how her grandfather was a butcher in Guadalupe Bravo, which is right outside of Juarez. And all of a sudden, on the page 24, right, it takes it a totally different direction, where a lady ends up crying over that. So yeah, Vanessa, what did you think of that?
Well, it definitely kind reminded me of Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club.
Yeah.
Um, I also was not expecting that ending. It was crazy. Because it seems really lighthearted. They're talking about how, well, she's talking about how her mom loves going to Costco and how they're looking at everything. And then her mom's like, oh, just wait right here. And then next thing we know, there's a woman that's crying. So it's really
Yeah.
interesting the way that it evolves the story.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the mention of the violence and what is right. Of all
Yeah.
places, Costco, where again, you just kind of have like mecca of capitalism, shopping, and they have this presentation about the efficacy of the knives, and this moment of break where it brings in kind of this reality. Well, you sell it to the cartels. Imagine what kind of work you can do with that. Yeah, it's kind of like a jarring break in what we've been seeing in the narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's especially. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Especially what?
Especially interesting that the guy that's showing the knives, he doesn't really understand what's going on, so he kind of laughs along because it starts off as a joke, and he kind of laughs along like, oh haha, but he really doesn't know what's going on.
Well, like it's him, like they're acting to him, like his presentation, right? Which I think is kind of funny too.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, he's described as like a blonde kid,
Yeah,
and so
and
he does.
they're speaking in Spanish, so he doesn't. It's assumed that he doesn't know what they're saying.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, Richie, as well, that there's dark humor in it, right? I mean, it starts off as like being, some guy in the bimbo cap, right, who says it. Así cortan pescuezos rapidín, right? And everyone laughs, but it kind of becomes like something darker, right? In the end, like we talked about, and that nervous laughter, of like, should we really be laughing at something like this? Something that is, morbid,
Yeah.
something that is really happening. I like that about this story, because like you said, it's something that we all do. We all go shopping in some way, um, but to think that even in Costco you can't escape the widest violence is very interesting. You're still gonna relive that trauma, however that lady, the señora, is feeling it. Whether it's from the news, which in Juarez we've talked about how in Juarez the news doesn't really censor anything, or even the lady might have suffered a loss or what have you. But um, I think there came a certain point where everyone was being affected by the drug war. So, but it does show the privilege, privilege in the sense that the blonde boy, you know, being in America, right? Probably, of course, does not have any family over there and would not, that's why he's kind of just, you know, looks confused about it. And also, I think the of course that he doesn't know the Spanish, but I think there's a dual layer there of like, well, he's kind of sheltered by that because of the fact that he's in El Paso.
Mhm.
The next one is another short story called Manflowers, and I think this is to me one that takes it the story's a really interesting direction. Um, First, which is kind of describing the title of the story in the third paragraph. Well, even in the first paragraph, right? It serves as a warning, and we've all read stories like that, right? Where someone says, "Don't go over there," right? Don't go to that house. Don't pass by that house. Don't go to that neighborhood or whatever.
Yeah.
And but then so you're thinking, well, what is it, right? But then in the third paragraph, like you really find out, as it says, um, Las Manfloras, women who are like men, who live together like lovers. I like the word manflowers better. I'd say it in my head and think about the word, imagining what type of plant manflowers would be if they really existed. So it becomes something else. You think, well, I don't know, is it like people who, abduct you or something, right?
El cucuy, right? Like it almost has
Yeah, Kukurin.
that kind of like warning that's
Yeah.
little kids are told, which speaks a lot to kind of the also the cultural gap, right? Of maybe not understanding
Mm.
this lifestyle just yet, especially in older generations, right? That
Yeah.
they have to mention it as such, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it becomes, as you mentioned, there's a shift, right? It becomes about, she describes queer brown love.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts. Are we thinking of page 26?
Yeah, that's the next
Or
page over, right? Because she
yeah.
kind of talks a little bit just more about like that age, that time period, and kind of eating the berries from the trees.
Mm-hmm.
But then it kind of has this shift, right? Where she talks about, and it wasn't until after I became a single mother that I learned about queer brown love, how it was the truest, like wrapping your arms around your very own skin in another body, which kind of references the passage you read, right? That line. Um,
Yeah.
um, and so she kind of talks about now at this point in her life, and then kind of her this relationship that she's in.
Yeah. I mean, that paragraph also, besides the identity of she was a single mother, and she learns about this kind of love, right? That she sees as the truest. And it kind of takes me back to like, sonnets, right? To experience sonnets and how it talks about, the truest form of love and all. And yeah, it's still a paragraph in the passage that, this the narrator is suffering from postpartum depression.
Right.
Someone like, you know, takes me back to the yellow wallpaper, right? And
Mhm.
she's got a 2-year-old, and so I think it doesn't just settle in the sentimentality of it, but it brings it and makes it real. more real, I should say, by bringing in, what mothers go through, and especially single moms. And so I think it's just one paragraph, but it makes it very powerful because of it.
Yeah.
Vanessa, was there something that jumped out at you from this one?
Um, I really liked the paragraph about two paragraphs right before the one we just talked about.
Mhm.
About going on bike rides with her friend
Mm.
and how they would get the
The moras?
yes.
Yeah.
And it seemed well, it didn't seem, it felt very real. Like I
Mhm.
remember going on bike rides like all over my street with my sister. So it felt very real to me.
Mm. Yeah, I love the imagery she uses at the end of that kind of section of time where she talks about her friend's smiling face. Right, it was spotted with moving shadows from leaves that in flashes blocked the sunlight. Like I think it's a very
Mm,
powerful image that I can relate to. It's the kind of things I'll notice, and so it's a nice image before kind of entering this future time period, right? Where
mhm,
the rest of the story.
And it's an interesting contrast too, because if I remember correctly, the the parents, and his dad, right? Like they don't like him, because they're too bitter or whatever, right? And they also don't like, and I'm sure y'all have seen, right, how it like stains the sidewalk. Um, so it's kind of another way of like appreciating something that isn't appreciated, and it even becomes like very sensuous, in that passage that you read, Rishi, right before, where it says, "We'd eat them instead of like being pretend dog food, laughing and squeezing as we punch them into our mouths, the juice sanguine and bitter." So it becomes another kind of ritual, food here that, people would just think of as like a nuisance, right? As this described. Um, so I think part of this story is also about appreciating the little things, those moments, like you said, Vanessa, about bike rides and, you know, picking up those blackberries or whatever.
Yeah, and also maybe to kind of go along with Vanessa's, like there's a section here that just kind of reminds me of my favorite times growing up in my 20s of just going out and dancing, especially to some of the local bands that would play cumbias. Those were
Mm.
some of the most fun times, and I felt like connected with my people. The people that Gris is writing about and talking about, and I really, my heart felt at place in these sections, like knowing that I know these people, I've been out with them dancing and just kind of like you said, enjoying the little things in those moments, and that's kind of what it is, a night out dancing. She also goes to
mm,
mention how much of a hard worker, she talks about cat eyes, right? And supporting herself and her family, working a lot and full-time nursing student. You see a lot of these stories too of people working hard, extra, to support them and their families.
mm,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds grueling, right? Having babies, working part time, being a full time nursing student, that in itself, I mean, that's just crazy. And but it does speak to that what we talked about in the first episode, which is, that these are characters who do live lives where they struggle, and it makes it more real. It makes it more relatable. It also speaks to the way that the U.S. is, in terms of there's a lot of rampant poverty, and resources aren't equally distributed. So people do have to do this in order just to survive. And yet, like you said, Richie, I mean, she's still able to like find time to go out and dance.
And love,
Yeah.
which you see a lot in here. She often uses that imagery of being intertwined with someone. I think is a perfect way to describe that kind of love in the moment of just having someone to support you, because that's kind of what vines do, right? They entangle in each other, intertwine, and they become stronger.
Mm.
Yeah, and then it's her birthday too. Towards the end, and we've talked about food a little bit, and here, we get some more of that, which I'm sure, probably uh, reminds you all of things of get-togethers. But she says she was roasting chiles and chopping onions next to a large granite molcajete. Um, and then she just says, I feel special. And Cat Eye's response, you are, Reina. Um, and then, like you said, it ends with that vine imagery. Um, but it does show, how these special moments are created around food, around dancing, and between women, who do work hard, and they still find time to like these joyful moments.
Yeah, it's beautiful brown queer love resistance.
Yeah,
How about that model right there for living?
right.
Wow. How are we doing in this section? How much time do we have?
It's 1 o'clock.
Oh, so we still
And
have, yeah.
yeah, I think um well, I think we should talk about the title poem, which is on the next page, paired up with the artwork from Los Dos, which we talked about last time because it's on the cover. But this is a Coatlicue Girl, the poem. And one of my strong lines from it was, I had forgotten Coatlicue Girl. There lives the hum of mantis, the macaw in you. And it ends, 500 years later, I remember. Um, and when it's paired up with the art, from Los Dos, I think it it isn't like something from like, I mean, it's almost like something from where it does make it come alive. It does make the page come alive, and um, the nature imagery, I think, also really struck me about this one. Whether it's the mantis, the macaw, and
Folding cricket wings.
Mm.
yeah, the breaststones, which we see in the piece itself, the sculpture.
Yeah, actually, I didn't make that parallel. Right, it looks like a kind of like indigenous sculpture, like in a maybe like a water jug or
Mhm.
vase.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is like the original facsimile representation of Coatlicue. And
Which represents like fertility, right? And then just the earth,
yeah,
Mother Earth.
yeah, um, and this is probably my favorite artwork from it, the whole collection.
Yeah,
Um,
you can see why it became the cover art too,
yeah,
because you have like the reference to the warrior mentality.
hmm
I talked about the Zapatista, like that imagery there on the T-shirt,
yeah,
and it's almost like both are looking forward, right? The character on the shirt, but also this woman
Mm.
standing there. She's wearing the mask, snake mask, and you had already alluded to it, but you had talked about kind of the imagery of not just Coatlicue, but Tonantzin kind of being morphed into La Virgin, right?
yeah,
And then
yeah.
you see like the lines around the head, kind of in a similar fashion you would see in artwork depicting La Virgin.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I hadn't noticed that. Yeah, it's a good pickup.
So yeah, and then just kind of this reference to 500 years later and remembering. I think that's a key there, right? How do we remember, our past, and for a lot of Chicana uh, people, that's kind of always been a concern, right? Because there's a lot of history of colonization and and just like the murder of ancestors, and like again, just kind of the mixing of peoples and erasure of cultures that I think is one of the main concerns. And how can we refine that part of ourselves, or again, find power in it, identity in it.
Yeah.
Vanessa, was there something that you wanted to highlight from the poem or the accompanying art?
I feel like you guys got everything.
Once again.
So
I
I'm
know.
just gonna let you talk first now, all the time.
Yeah.
That's not what I was asking for.
Oh.
I'm just kidding.
Well, what about the way that she's dressed? I mean, you kind of referenced it a little bit, Richie. The mixture, right? The zapatista shirt, the warrior, the indigenous connection, but it's also modern, at the same time. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Vanessa?
Yes?
Oh, okay. I was waiting for you to respond.
Oh, I didn't have a response.
Oh,
Um,
that was a long silence.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I got disconnected or what, but
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I'm curious. So what kind of modernity do you see in the image?
well, the shirt, and then
Hmm.
is it the like a skirt, or I don't know if it's a skirt or like shorts.
Really shorts.
Yeah,
yeah,
and
I think
then
so.
I don't know if it's um like what are the heels, whatever those kinds of shoes are called.
He said those look modern.
Yeah, I mean, don't you guys think? And coupled with
Yeah.
the shawl that she's kind of seems wrapping around her waist as if like she's gonna dance with it. I think it's in the representation of like how we still try to preserve uh, indigenous roots, assuming we have like to the extent that we know that we have them, right? Because of course not everyone does, but
Mm.
um, I don't know, that's another way I also see the work.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, it looks like she's ready to jump in on some zapateado, which is
Mm-hmm.
a type of dance style from Mexico, which is rhythmic, and then you just see dancing wearing those shoes, right? Which they're made that way so you can strike the shoe down to the rhythm of the music.
Yeah.
And again, talking about relating, I've been to a couple huapangos, right, where people bring the jaranas, and they bring the kind of like the platform to dance
Mm-hmm.
on, and hit the sound. So yeah, that's more good imagery there to draw a lot from,
Yeah.
a lot from the image, and again, paired up with the poem, just breathes a lot of life into it.
Yeah, I mean, I can almost see that the art kind of the girl, do the dance, because yeah, like you said, it's part of those dances where it's kind of like I guess Americans would see it as a kind of tap dancing, but it's more complex than that. And a lot of it is about the visual of the waving of the shawl, you know, um, that they do as well. And um, so yeah, I mean, it's a amazing work of art that really is very well. I'd be interested in kind of finding out how Chris collaborated with Los Dos, in terms of giving them the whole poem or giving them like a line or something.
Yeah, there you go. There's a question right there.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mark that down. Yeah. I mean, truth be told, there's so many poems. Like, man, and if only we had more time, But I can't wait till she's on the show and we can kind of ask these questions, or get her feedback.
Yeah.
on a lot of these pieces.
So Oral History is, I think, the shortest poem. But Vanessa, did you want to read it first to listen for listeners and then talk about it?
Yeah. Okay. So it's on page 38. Ask me about the stories I'd rather tell than write.
So why was this your favorite?
It was my favorite because I think that the oral, oh my gosh, telling of stories is equally as important as writing them down. Because those you can pass on through generations as well. Like the history of your family and of your people. And that's how it was originally done, is by telling these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by singing them as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clever in the sense that it's an open invitation, and I just think that some stories, there's a power to some stories that's held in them from sharing them in person with other people than just reading it off of a page, because it involves other people. You know, like again, I keep using the word community, but that's one of the joys in life, I think, is just being with people and sharing stories with each other. And also there's like the little indication that maybe they're not meant to be published. Like maybe there's some some juicy stuff in there, and it's just meant to be told amongst people, like face to face.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting meta component to think about that harkens back to the epigraph. But I kind of have this picture of like a campfire discala or whatever, and yeah, it is also kind of rooted, like you said, Vanessa, in the indigenous culture, in the indigenous tradition. That like you said, Richie, was violently erased, right, by colonization, and you know both through genocide, but also through, unfortunately, of course, like a lot of rape of indigenous women by the colonizers. And, like you were saying, it's kind of that coming of age that I see here, because as the speaker of the poet, she's again calling to the reader, right? Like, just like she said earlier in another of her poems, she's calling to reader to be asked, and so there is this kind of demand for attention that, rightfully so, this is something that cannot be read and right. It needs to be told. And that's why I think I also see it so short, because you can't write it. She has to tell it to you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. In a way, it also acts as kind of like almost like a caveat, because I think I know that she has so many more stories that don't necessarily fit in this collection, but it's just kind of a recognition that, as people, we're creatures of storytelling. We're nothing without our stories, and so we have them within us, right? But in this case, not all her stories fit in this specific collection, so just like ask me about them. A brief little bio note that from Gris's life is she had a brief stint as a comedian, as a life and stand-up comedy. Very, very brief, but I know she for a time she went out and did some stand-up comedy routines, and I think that was centered more around like relationships and exes. And pretty and considering her performativity, like her strength and performance, I think she did well, and I think that's an interesting. It's always interesting to see storytellers become comedians, or rather comedians who kind of incorporate storytelling in their routines.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a really cool piece, and we should ask her about some of them when she's on the show.
Yeah.
Yes.
So did you all want to talk about the next story, which was Weekend?
Yes, we did want to talk about this one.
What did it did
Um,
it did you want to talk about connections first, or what you or your thoughts and impressions on it? Um,
well, this one takes place in Central El Paso, so that's
mhm,
a lot closer to home for me. Um, I really enjoy being able to see like my hometown represented in stories. This is really cool.
And besides the setting, what did you think about the character and her day to day life in this neighborhood?
I think she's trying her best to help, like to provide for herself and her kid. Um,
Hmm.
but she's also, I would say that she's like not desperate to like just to do anything, like to be
Hmm.
able to do that. She's like very particular in like how she wants herself represented,
Hmm.
which really, I really like that about her.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know.
Mm.
And there's a certain banality to it too. I think it's kind of that day to day life, right? I mean, she's doing laundry, trying to find quarters, right? Um, she goes to the fruteria, which it's something emblematic, right, of like La Frontera here, and then the 7-Eleven, so a lot of like day to day tasks just to how much she struggles because she has a baby.
Yeah.
And so it's the
Mhm,
second character we've seen, I think, already that has one and is single.
Yeah. Well, she said, like as she says, towards the end, what she does to get by. But I think this piece is really important because it details also what she's not willing to do to get by. And I think
mhm,
so. So first of all, I really love the start of the piece in which she's going through purses, going through jackets, looking for any kind of loose change, which I think some of us may have been through before, right?
Yeah.
She's not exactly. She's waiting for some cash to come in, and until then though you kind of have to make it. And she's the thing you mentioned as well, being able to provide, but also just that aspect of having to kind of do the math, like, all right, well, I have enough for this later so I can get buy this. You
mm,
know what you're going to buy because you know what you need to buy in order to make it right, to the meal. And so her kind of concern during this is getting, what is it, some milk, right, for her
Hmm.
kid.
mhm,
And walking down to the corner store, there's that again. And you have this incident of I think a very important aspect of, you have this kind of man preying on her, right?
Hmm.
And she talks about the male gaze, and a very important thing to recognize, right? And so you have this confrontation, ultimately, in which he's trying to entice her, you know with a job that isn't necessarily just a job itself, right? It's really shady. It's But you see, in this moment, that she's not willing to sacrifice that part of herself, right? Because she has, she's looking for money, she's trying to get by. And despite that, she won't sacrifice her dignity in that sense, right? And so at the very end, I think, is that kind of that striking chord, right? If this collection is that song in the epilogue, right? I think the very last line of this piece is that power chord that she strikes as a writer, and it just reverberates throughout. That just
mm.
stands out, where she says, "We just had to make it till Monday."
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very well said. Um, Vanessa, what did you make of that turn? It's something we've seen before, right? With like Costco, where it takes that dark turn.
I really like her ability to do that.
Yeah.
Um, that paragraph about the male gaze, I also I felt like was one of the strongest ones because it really describes it really well, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, I really do like that she's not willing to give up that part of herself in order to get the money.
Yeah, and it is, very predatory, because the guy, like, he's rich, right? He's driving like some kind of luxury sports car. He's like literally just praying in the sense that he's just looking to see. And then he even
Mhm.
asked her, right? Like, do you know any young mothers or students, right? And I don't
Yeah.
know about you all, but it's a story. I've heard similar stories, people who are like this, who like offer rights to women like that with that enticement, right? Um, so it is again something that is very real. Um,
Mhm.
I think, it's also a bit complicated because I think, if a woman were to make this decision of like selling her body, there's a lot of sex work theorists out there who
Right.
do provide a lot of like context, for like this is because like they got to make a living, right? I mean, just like her. And so I don't think necessarily, even if she does, there would be, I don't think we could blame her, right? And but at the same time, I think it does speak a lot to like what she does and the purchasing, and we get this beautiful list of grocery items, the beans,
Mm.
the onion, Roma tomatoes, Mexican calabazas, and fideo, and green grapes. So I thought that was something worth noting as well.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that because during my point I didn't mean to imply that. Yeah, not to speak ill of anyone who's had to make that choice. It speaks to maybe a larger issue at hand that is more complex. So
Mm.
I really appreciate you mentioning that. Man.
No, yeah, I think I've learned a lot about from other scholars, in sex work, and um, I think it's just it kind of reminds me of what's going on right now with a lot of people were complaining about looting, but Kimberly Jones, who's an author and activist, she put out this video talking about, well, like, are we looking at like why people are doing that? Why the does someone gonna risk getting arrested or even killed, tear gas, simply for like a bag of beans or rice or what have you, or a television, so I think it's important to kind of talk about the conditions, and this woman, she's completely um, um, someone who is in need, and so you can kind of see how easily she could succumb to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a true point. Often in these cases, it's always important to zoom out and examine the conditions in which this has been made to happen. That it even has to become an option.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And lastly, I know I'm talking a lot about it, but yeah, this story had a lot of strong lines for me. I also like how what you were talking about, Vanessa, the male gaze, and in 43, it kind of comes full circle because she says, I had learned to identify when someone was preying on me. Life had taught me that ability. And so
Mm.
I think it's a very strong line because it speaks to the reality of women that a lot of men don't realize, right? And I think, hetero men in particular, that, this is just something that even as she says, right, girls who are as little as 10 have
Mhm.
to learn the hard way or just be taught by the parents about it, because of course that age they're like pure, innocent, um or I mean like naive, right, unaware of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
um yeah, so I think we just have one more poem, which is I think the longest poem so far, Spec, uh, and it's also a performance poem.
Yeah, and also it's interesting this poem and the last one I think we were gonna, or in this section at least, on Guadalupe Bravo. I think
Mhm.
both of them are. I think we mentioned earlier. There's little connections in between the pieces. For example, the beer run and the one we just talked about. The whole grocery store. the corner store thing, but even in Costco, right? She actually uses the word spec, just talking about Guadalupe Bravo as well. I think so. Now we have two poems back to back that kind of explore that. Oh, I know. Like spec is really a really good piece, but I know you had some stuff to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the imagery in it, and thank you for pointing that out. It just makes this a very interesting collection because of how it does weave in the stories, and they interlace with each other. But as I was reading it, I was thinking a lot of what's happening right now and the needed calls for racial justice. And on 44, um, the justice I seek is immeasurable, and I don't know if maybe also that's an allusion to like, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, right? About, measuring your life in coffee spoons. But
so I can say for sure that, yeah, she did a Tumble Words workshop back in the day, where she read and she performed, and we wrote pieces inspired by that T.S. Eliot poem.
Interesting.
So cool catch there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite poems as well. As I know it is yours, Richie.
Yep.
And it's a very strong line to me. I mean, even just standing alone, you don't even need to look at it in context, but I think it is something that needs to be performed. It's something that needs to be said. In other words, chanted, just like it's going on right now with a lot of the rallies and protests where they do have these kinds of chants. So that was one thing that really stood out to me. I think the other is the vagaries of details. On 45, like, I'm a speck despising the dust of heat and car exhausts in your face and tired buses, the meow of desert poverty, and always the grimy feel on my black patent leather shoes. So you get once again the hard knock life details, right? This is a hard life, and the dust that you gather that is all around you because of the poverty, right? As she mentions, the desert poverty is also something that jumped out at me a lot. And lastly, the last thing for me was you mentioned the connection to Guadalupe Bravo, the next prose poem. And I see it here in 46. She talks about the Virgin Mary, right? And but she talks about, in that middle stanza, the plastic bunches we leave at the altar are dyed blue and unnatural. The flowers of the poor and forgotten cemeteries you only visit once a year to water the headstone. And so this poem also calls out the need to honor and remember the dead. And of course, we have Dia de los Muertos in Mexico and in the US to an extent. And I think it's just very powerful to think about how we do forget our loved ones, and that sometimes it's just like once a year we go to clean up, the headstone. And so it goes back to the connection, the land, right? The sacred land that she talks about at the bottom, that we all need to remember as well.
Yeah, I mean, all great points, and I'd love to see her perform this poem.
Yeah,
I was also thinking that,
because I do remember reading this, and I think at her book release, I think this is one that she read, and she invokes a lot of power in her voice.
Yeah, I mean, there's very powerful single line stanzas. On 45 as well, I was remembering I don't want to kneel, which, if you think about it in the today's context, I mean, it means something else entirely. But if we think about it in the context of the poem, it kind of shows that like she doesn't want to like necessarily assimilate into that kind of like religious lifestyle, right? Of like sitting in the pew and paying homage to a Christian God. Um, so it's an interesting kind of resistance that goes back to respecting her indigenous roots instead of the colonizers' own. Vanessa, any strong lines that jumped out at you?
I like that this one starts off with talking about rain, whereas before we've mostly seen fire.
Mm.
So I thought that was really interesting. There is a lot of really good imagery in this one as well. I like
Mm-hmm.
the one that you talked about earlier, about the headstone.
Mm-hmm.
I also really like on page 45, the second stanza. It says, "It's the snap of the sheet that gives us life, that pushes us up and out, but always back to the backwards dance that leads to the wanting again." And so for me
Yeah.
that one, sorry, for me that one kind
Okay.
of represented like the struggles that we have in life, but eventually like it's supposed to encourage you to keep going, kind of
Mm.
like you
And it's
become
interesting that,
stronger.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it's represented as a dance as well, and that goes back to,
Mm-hmm.
the Coatlicue as well.
Yeah.
Richie, did you have anything else to add?
Um, Not with this one. I mean, you kind of called the lines that stood out to me too as well, especially
Oh, I did it again too.
the justice I speak is immeasurable.
Yeah.
And like you said, this is he says these really strong kind of one-liners that lends itself, I think, to really good translation from page to stage. And also, again, the kind of the bleed into the next one as well, on about Guadalupe Bravo.
Yeah, but what about that one? That this is our last one. This is about half of the work. And as you mentioned, Guadalupe Bravo is where the grandfather was from, right, in Costco. So it does have that intertextuality to it. But what did you make of this one in terms of that connection to spec?
I mean, so you talk about like honoring the dead and this buying flowers or tributes to leave at the headstone. In this
Mm-hmm.
case, right, you bring up again the violence happening in Mexico. In this case, kind of the sadness of not being able to go there and return and visit their graves because of the violence, because of all the murders.
Yeah, I mean, as she says there, right, in the second line, tuvieron que cerrarlo después de tanta matanza. And I remember that, I remember that like not just cemeteries, but like morgues were filling up with bodies, that like they just couldn't, they couldn't even bury them, and it is very sad. And it's interesting that it's in Guadalupe Bravo, not Juarez per se, kind of hinting at like, well, it stretched beyond Juarez, which was the epicenter for many years. And there's also a connection to the land at the end, the little details of like, compramos cocas en vidrio y dulces de camote. And coca is interesting as a choice, because it's in the tradition, you kind of put in there the favorite food of the person who has passed. But coca itself, is made from sugar cane in Mexico, but in the US, it's corn syrup. So I don't know if that's intentional, but I kind of interpret it as kind of more rooted in Mexican culture. And she talks about "me acostaba en la tierra como si entre las manos de Dios," kind of just embracing the land, the sacredness of the land as well. Especially, what could be more sacred, right, than the panteon, the Camposanto, as she calls it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of going back to that kind of spiritual connection to the land. as well.
Yeah.
Like I remember, I think I mentioned this off show with you guys, but I had participated at one point in a sweat, a spiritual kind of sweat lodge experience with Gris. And I remember that one of the things we did is as we entered the little room, you had to thank the land, Omateo, which is kind of like a gracing the land. And kind of that was an interesting experience. I'll wait till she's on to kind of bring up that specific memory, and she can speak a little bit more to what was going on there. But that's such a significant aspect of it, right? The praise to the land, connection to it.
Yeah. Because of that colonization, we it has been taken, right? And a lot of indigenous communities have been displaced or outright, pillaged and murdered, going back, to manifest destiny and all that. But it is one of those rituals, right, that remembering the dead, that I think this collection is about daily life, it's about death, and it's about birth as well. So I really like how this work is very cyclical in terms of that. The Coatlicue is about, like you said, fertility, the fertility goddess, the earth goddess, right? The connection to the land that a lot of times we lose because of that modernization and colonization and assimilation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been mentioned before, but it bears repeating since you were just talking about it. Is it did take her a long time to get this collection published. A lot of that had to do with she wasn't really sure if she just wanted to publish just poems or just short stories. Folk may kind of make them different books, but in the end, I think she did make a right call by putting them all together. And probably this is in the process of writing and revising, but kind of finding a way to connect them all together in that sense, because they are, she says maybe a coming of age story in a way.
Yeah. And so I think we'll stop there for this episode.
For sure, much more to come.
Just reminding listeners again, if you do have questions, please send those in. You can message us, or you can contact Gris, and maybe she can show them to us once we get to talk to her, hopefully. But yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Coatlicue Girl by Gris Muñoz. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.